Hello, and welcome to tonight's virtual information session on the proposed Beaverton Charter of 2021. My name is Cynthia Moffett, and I will be your MC for this event. While some of you may recognize me from my involvement with the City of Beaverton's Diversity Advisory Board, please note that I am not here as a representative of the board. I am hosting this event in an individual capacity as a Beaverton resident, just like many of you out there watching this evening. We are hosting this charter information session for you, the community, to learn more about this proposed ballot measure and to get your questions answered. Our format will first feature an informational presentation given by Jim Johnson, Senior Project Manager with the National Policy Consensus Center at Portland State University, which provides a neutral forum to assist cities, counties, and other government entities. Jim worked as the lead consultant with Beaverton City Council in facilitating the work sessions they held on charter review and in helping the Beaverton City Attorney's Office with potential language changes to the proposed charter. After the presentation, we will pivot to a panel of participants to take questions from the audience. Our Q&A panel will feature Jim Johnson, City Councilor Marc Sanssouci, one of the city councilors that advocated for this ballot measure, and Steve Smelly from the Beaverton Area Chamber of Commerce Business Advocacy Council, who has come out in opposition of this measure. Should you wish to ask a question during this event, please use the chat feature that is available within this webcast. Please note that every attempt will be made to answer all questions in the order received in the time allotted. If your question does not get answered during this session, please email it to citymail@beavertonoregon.gov for it to be forwarded to the appropriate party to follow up. This event will be recorded for broadcast. The program will be repeated many times on Tualatin Valley Community Television, Channel 23, prior to the May 19th primary election. Now, let's get started. Jim will give his presentation, which features the PowerPoint slides he presented at the January 7th, 2020 Beaverton City Council meeting. A PDF of the PowerPoint slides is available on the Charter Virtual Information Sessions webpage, beavertonoregon.gov/charterinfosessions. A pre-recorded version of the presentation as a standalone video is also available on the same page. Jim, over to you.
As Cynthia mentioned, my name is Jim Johnson. I work for the National Policy Consensus Center, which is located in Portland State University. My background is working in local government. I was the county administrator in Lane County for 9 years and the city manager in Eugene for about 5 years. I've been the interim city manager in the city of Roseburg and the interim city administrator in the city of Cresswell and the city of Vernonia. As Cynthia mentioned, in Beaverton, I helped the city council in their effort to review and revise the city charter. The council held 9 work sessions in open public meetings between September 2019 and February 2020. They also held 2 public hearings to receive public feedback on the proposed city charter. After these efforts, the council decided to submit to the voters of Beaverton a ballot measure proposing a revised city charter. My presentation will last about 10 minutes. It presents some basic facts about city charters and provides a short summary of the revised charter for Beaverton that's on the May ballot. Next slide, please. I'm going to answer about 10 questions about the city charter. What is a city charter? Why refer the proposed city charter for voter consideration? What are the common forms of government in Oregon? What forms of government were studied by the Beaverton Mayor and Council? What would the proposed city charter do if passed? What would be the role of elected officials under the proposed city charter? What would be the role of city officers under the proposed city charter? What are some next steps? What would be the cost to taxpayers if the measure passes? And finally, what would happen if the proposed city charter does not pass? Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So what is a city charter? The US federal government and the state of Oregon each have constitutions, while cities in Oregon have charters. Constitutions and charters are sort of foundational documents describing how the government is organized and how it will govern itself. They are the legal documents that define the organization, powers, functions, and essential procedures of the government. Some examples: the US Constitution describes the roles and powers of the President, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. The Oregon Constitution describes the roles and powers of the governor, the legislature, and the state Supreme Court. And finally, the City of Beaverton Charter describes the roles and powers of the mayor, the city council, and city officers. The charter describes the basic framework within which the city conducts its business. Next slide. So why refer the proposed city charter? It is common for cities and counties to periodically review their charters. The current city charter was approved by voters in November of 1980. That's about 40 years ago, and was amended once in 2008 when voters changed a section relating to urban renewal. Next slide. So what are the common forms of government in Oregon? There are about 241 cities in Oregon, and they're organized into 4 basic forms of government. And these 4 forms are described in each of the city's charters. The first is the mayor-council form. Smaller Oregon cities typically have the mayor-council form, in which the legislative and policy-making body is through a popularly elected mayor and council. The second is the commission form of government. Portland is the only city in the state with the commission form of government, where the elected commissioners function collectively as the city council and also serve as the administrators of city departments. Third form of government is a strong mayor. Beaverton is the only city in the state with the strong mayor form, in which the mayor, serving as the chief executive officer, has the authority to appoint city staff, is responsible for city administration, and serves as the presiding officer at council meetings. Fourthly is the council manager form. Most Oregon cities with populations over 2,500 have the council manager or council administrator form, in which the council hires and then can fire a chief executive officer to be responsible for the daily supervision of city affairs. Next slide. What forms of government were studied by the mayor and council? As they considered the form of government for the future, the council focused on 2 of the 4 methods of governance in Oregon. First was the current strong mayor form of government, and second was the council manager form of government. They looked at charters suggested by the National Civic League and also by the League of Oregon Cities. They reviewed charter language from a variety of cities in Oregon and from around the country. Next slide. So if passed, what would the proposed city charter do? If the measure passes, the proposed city charter would outline details related to the city's form of government, to term limits, and language preferences. The city council would appoint a full-time city manager for an indefinite term to oversee the city's day-to-day operations. The city manager would be an at-will employee who could be fired by a majority of the elected officials, consistent with local laws and their employment agreement. The city manager would not be an elected position. The city council would increase from 5 members to include 7 members, and that would be 6 part-time city councilors and 1 full-time mayor with voting privileges. The city council would serve as the city's governing body and be responsible for the city's legislative functions. In addition to serving on the city council, the mayor would serve as the chief elected official. All city council positions would be nonpartisan and elected at large by Beaverton voters. Next slide. If passed, what would the proposed city charter do? And this is continuing from the previous slide. The city councilors and the mayor would be limited to 3 consecutive 4-year terms in office for their respective positions. In other words, there would be term limits. A councilor or mayor who reached the 3-term limit would be allowed to run again for election to the same office, but only after a break in service. The term limit does not prevent a term-limited mayor from running for election as a councillor, nor a term-limited councillor from running for election as a mayor. The new city charter would remove gender-exclusive references. The mayor or a councillor could be removed from office for unethical or criminal conduct. The city's indebtedness would not be allowed to exceed debt limits imposed by state law, and a public hearing before the city council would be required to adopt any ordinance. Next slide. So what is the role of elected officials under the proposed city charter? If the proposed city charter passes, the council would approve the city's budget and adopt city laws and regulations. They would set goals and objectives for city staff and for city business. They would hire a professional city manager based on that person's education, experience, skills, and abilities, and then supervise the manager. They would also have the authority to remove the city manager at any time consistent with an employment agreement. Next slide. So what is the role of the city manager under the proposed city charter? If the measure passes, the city manager would be an at-will employee who could be fired by a majority of elected officials consistent with local laws and their employment agreement. The city manager could propose the city budget for consideration by the budget committee and then by the mayor and council. City manager could recruit, hire, supervise, and may terminate the city staff. The city manager serves as the mayor and councilor's chief advisor by providing complete and objective information about city operations, providing options for their consideration, offering an assessment of the long-term consequences of decisions, and making recommendations on how to manage the city and deliver services. The city manager could also carry out policies established by the mayor and council, enforce laws and regulations, and implement short and long-range city goals and objectives. Next slide, please. What are some next steps? First is the public vote. The Beaverton City Council referred the proposed city charter to Beaverton voters for the May 19th, 2020 primary election. The effective date: if approved, the proposed charter would become operative on January 1st, 2021. Next slide. If passed, what is the cost to taxpayers? The financial impact, if any, due to changes to city positions under the proposed city charter would be approximately $42,000. Because the proposed city charter would replace or modify existing positions included in the city's current charter. For example, the cost of adding a new city councilor position would be available from a redistribution of the mayor's existing salary to a new councilor position. The cost would be paid by the city's general fund through an existing revenue stream, and there would be no fiscal impact to taxpayers. Next slide. So what happens if the proposed city charter does not pass? Nothing happens. The city would continue to operate as it does under the existing charter. The city's present mayor-council form of government would remain in place, and there would be no fiscal impact. And last slide. And that's it for the presentation. Thank you.
Now it's time for Q&A. Panel, thank you for being here today to answer our audience questions. For each question, I will pose it to all of you to answer. Before we get started, we've already had an opportunity to hear from Jim Johnson, and I would like to give Councillor Sanssouci and Steve Smelly a chance to introduce themselves. Marc, we'll start with you.
Hi there. My name is Marc Sanssouci. I'm a city councilor here in Beaverton. I'm in my 12th year of service on the city council. And among many other interests of mine in serving my community as a city councilor, I like to pay attention to the details of the language of our resolutions and ordinances. And I had a particularly strong interest in how this charter project proceeded, because I wanted to make sure that as we developed this proposed charter for the voters to consider, that we were basically looking at best practices of city charters from across the state and across the country. So as Mr. Johnson mentioned, we looked at some examples from other places, and we tried to give serious consideration to some of the opportunities and challenges that we thought might be presented by a new charter for the city. So I'm looking forward to questions from everybody, and of course, all of you who are participating, I'm sure, are avid readers of the voters pamphlet. The voters pamphlet contains a lot of information, both from me and from others, about perspectives on this vote that's before the voters. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Steve, would you like to say a few words?
We're going to re-invite him. Just apologize.
We apologize for a little glitch.
There it is. Hi, I'm Steve Smelly. I'm the owner and founder of Goldfinch Consulting. I'm a Beaverton resident, and I serve on the Beaverton Chamber of Commerce, Area Chamber of Commerce, on the Business Advocacy Council and the Candidate Endorsement Council. I chair both of those for the chamber. And I too have been interested in this process that we've been going through and have been paying attention to it since September. So I'm looking forward to answering any questions and seeing what we can do to create clarity for all the voters, because I think that that's important. So thank you.
Thank you. Let's get started. For each question, we will rotate the order for who answers first. Our first question is, which current offices will disappear when the new charter takes effect? Will another election be required to elect officials to the new offices under the charter changes? The first question, we are going to start with Jim.
That's probably a good question for Councillor Sanssouci to answer. Mark, why don't you go ahead with this one?
Okay, if I understand the question correctly, there would be no removal of any officers if this charter is adopted. What the charter proposes is that the role of the mayor would change from administrative and political to purely political, and the one new council position would be added. So we would end up with a 7-person council that includes the mayor as a voting member. The primary change in terms of other kinds of officers of the city is that a city manager would be hired by the council, so you'd have another senior staff position. But no elected positions would be removed, we would add one.
Thank you. And Steve, what are your thoughts?
I concur. That's factually correct. We would not reduce anybody's positions that are elected currently. We would add a full-time city manager, and we would add another paid city council.
Thank you. Next question. Were citizen review committees formed to review these charter changes? If not, why not? For the second question, we're going to start with Mark.
Thank you. That's a question we have heard before. In this particular instance, in the city of Beaverton, we chose not to try to create a citizen review committee for the charter. Many governments do that. Not all governments do that. Not all charter development procedures use review committees to do it. Sometimes there are special task forces created. Sometimes consultants are hired. Sometimes it's done essentially in-house by the elected team and the staff working together. We chose a little bit of a hybrid, which is that we hired Mr. Johnson, who helped us in his role as an experienced member of multiple local governments. And we used our city attorney and members of the city attorney's office. And then the 6 elected members of the Beaverton City Council and the mayor held the 9 work sessions that Mr. Johnson referred to. I think probably the simplest way to explain the reason not to use a citizen review committee is that we felt that it was going to be difficult to meet the timeline that we were trying to meet. We had about 9 to 10 months to accomplish the work. And in order to get it onto the ballot for the May 2020 ballot. And we believed that the most effective way and most efficient way was for those of us who had worked on the city council for the period of time that we have, to focus our time and energy on it in our work sessions and to use the expertise of Mr. Johnson and the city attorney's office. It's a choice. Other governments would make other choices, but that was the choice that we made.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so I do believe that the question is important. If we reviewed through the National Civic League, which was one of the documents that was reviewed and used by the city charter or the city council to look at and come up with some best practices. Chapter 2 of their pamphlet basically says that one of the best practices is to involve a charter review committee. And they go further to suggest that one of the best things to do is to actually have participants from a diverse group of the citizens. They're talking about 15 to 20 people in examples like that. So we've looked at the best practices in one sense and made decisions at the city council. And believe me, they've done tremendous work and put a lot of work and energy into it. And Jim's been along for a long ride on that process as well. So I commend the work that's been done and the thought and attention that's been done. But the citizen engagement was lacking. And I know that was a choice, and it was a choice for expediency. But when it comes down to 9 working sessions that were open forum sessions, but when we got to the end of that, we had 2 citizen review open opportunities for citizen review and commentary. And the first one, I think that there were about 5 people left in the room that knew that the meeting was happening and were participating. I was there for that one. Then the second one, there was more participation, but when we had one of the people who provided public testimony admit that they only found out about this very topic via somebody letting them know on Facebook, I think that that's a little bit challenging for our process. It's not as open and inclusive and inviting diversity that we pride our city in doing. And so that's the only reticence I have to the way that we went down the process.
Thank you, Steve. Jim, do you have thoughts on this?
Agree with Councilor Sanssouci that in my experience in local government, councilors choose to do things in different ways. Some do charter review commissions. Others will choose to do it themselves. So it just varies from council to council, from county commission to county commission.
Thank you. For the next question, we will start with Steve. The question is, did you look at council ward system rather than at-large council positions? And why was this option not chosen?
The answer is I didn't, because that wasn't on the table. So just as a citizen being involved, I will defer to the professionals. Okay.
Jim, you're actually up next.
The answer to the question is yes, it was brought up, but now I'll refer to Councilor Sanssouci, and he can explain what the council thought of that suggestion.
Yes, election of councilors by ward or district is something that was considered fairly early on in the process. Mr. Johnson and our city attorney, Mr. Kirby, took us through a list of questions of sort of major issues that we wanted to try to address with this charter proposal. And I think there was a pretty unanimous sense at the beginning of the process that districting for councilors was not something we wanted to try to tackle at this time. It's something that the city might want to consider as it continues to grow, but at a population of about 100,000, a districting proposal for the city would be perhaps a little bit too fine-grained, particularly because the distribution of populations in a city of our physical size is not that great. And secondly, it's a very complicated kind of mechanism to develop. You have to initiate boundaries. You have to make sure the boundaries are balanced. You have to figure out what the principles of balance are going to be. You have to identify what populations are meant to be represented by different kinds of balance, and find a way to do it without having strange things happening like gerrymandering or things of that sort. And so we figured that it is an important issue for the city to consider, but it's something for a future council to consider. And if you want a firsthand explanation of why these sorts of boundary questions can be challenging, ask your school board. And when they talk about boundaries between school assignments, the passions run high. And so we wanted to start with the elements of the charter for the city that were not quite so passionate as boundaries for districts, and let that be a separate discussion later on sometime.
Thank you, gentlemen. The next question is, the presentation states that the cost will be $42,000. Won't the salaries of the mayor/new council members exceed that figure? And what costs are associated with the city manager's office? We're going to start with Jim.
Okay. The cost figure was actually calculated by the city staff, so I'm not aware of all of the details that went into the $42,000. Clearly, there is a cost to hire a city manager, roughly, maybe perhaps in the neighborhood of $200,000. The current mayor's salary, however, is around $180,000 or so, 183 or something like that. And so if the mayor's salary is reduced because the mayor is no longer running city government, there will be some cost savings there. There will also be a cost to the new 7th city councilor. And I think that's around $19,000 for that. So the $42,000 figure was given to me by city staff. I believe that's the net after trying to do an estimate of both the expenses and the revenues associated with it. But in the end, they said it's about $42,000, and it can be handled with the existing revenues in the general fund of the city of Beaverton.
Thank you. Marc?
I'll just add a couple of additional details to that. And Mr. Johnson's right. It was our finance director and the finance team who developed the estimate. The city councilors are paid $19,200 a year. We're not part of PERS. We don't get insurance. That's the sum total. And then there's some expenses during the year, such as access to training or conferences or things like that. So maybe $22,000 for another councilor to be on the staff. Mr. Johnson's right. The mayor is currently paid $185,000, plus the mayor is part of the program that allows cashing out of some vacation time. So probably the net total of the mayor's pay for this current fiscal year is about $195,000 to $198,000. That, I would imagine that if the charter passes, that the council would choose to reduce the mayor's pay because the mayor would no longer be an administrative head, but would simply be the political leader of the city, and would have a different set of responsibilities. However, I also think at the same time that the cost of a city manager is not inconsiderable. I think it's fair to estimate perhaps $200,000 to $250,000 with all of the associated benefits and insurance and other things added in. So the estimate of $42,000 may be a little low in my opinion, but I would think that 100 would be the upper limit of the net cost to the city.
Thank you. Steve, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so the 42,000 that has been raised recently is a new number that I've only seen in the last week or so. And that's the challenge that I've got is just that. We're right up on the time for ballots to go out and elections, and there's not really clarity around what it really will cost. To Marc's point, I think that he's right. I think that it could be more than the $42,000. But the candid answer is, I don't know. And guess what? Nobody knows. We do know that there'll be the cost of a full-time city manager. And as Jim and Marc both said, that may be around $200,000, roughly around what we pay the mayor currently. There is an assumption that there would be a reduction of pay in the mayor, but that's not candidly defined or decided or outlined anywhere specifically. The current city charter does cover the mayor's compensation and indicates in the current charter, I believe, that the salary cannot be less than 80% of the salary of the district judge. That would go away with the new charter language, I believe. So there would be the flexibility to reduce the mayor's salary. But we're counting on certain things to happen that haven't been articulated, outlined, or any path to come up with that number. In fact, I would say that the people who are most engaged with this in the citizens of Beaverton would not have any idea how to explain that $42,000 number.
Thank you. Next question. There is a concern circulating on various social media that the city manager would have too much power as an unelected official. Can you address this? We're going to start with Marc.
Well, I think it's fair to say that the city manager would have most of the authority that the mayor has under our current system. And that authority comes primarily from the fact that the executive, we'll call it the executive, whether it's the mayor under our current system or the city manager under the proposed charter. The executive gets to hire the department heads. The executive has administrative authority over the activities of the departments. The executive is the one who develops the proposed budget for the city and presents it to the budget committee and the city council for consideration. So in general, the authority of the executive doesn't change significantly whether you retain the current strong mayor form of government or switch to a city manager form. What it does change is where that authority resides. However, one of the things we paid some attention to in developing this charter was the relationship between the council and the executive. We wanted to make sure that the authority of the executive was not unbounded or was even more bounded than in the model charter that we found from the League of Oregon Cities or the model charter from the National Civic League. We actually added some language in there that made it very clear that we wanted the council to have additional authorities and additional independence from the executive of the city, so that the balance of authority would be a little bit more balanced than it is under the current charter.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so the question really gets down to the city manager and them being appointed or somehow not elected in a position, as I understand the question. So the current city charter that we have under section 9B says that the mayor shall appoint and may remove an assistant to the mayor as such other officers the mayor deems necessary. The assistant to the mayor is the principal manager's aide to the mayor and shall perform such duties as may be assigned by the mayor. So the way I look at it, it's currently in our charter now to have a position like the city manager. It doesn't call it a city manager, but it's talking about that administrative management function in there. So there's not really a significant difference from my perspective between the current city charter and the new city charter in terms of the requirement of a city manager that's going to report to somebody, and that city manager would not be elected necessarily. That said, the question then becomes, who does that city manager report to and where is the accountability? So if the question is being asked from the terms of if not reporting to the electorate, the voters, then who do they respond to? Marc's very correct. The change would be from reporting directly to the mayor as the elected official head of the city, that they would then report to the entirety of the council, which would be comprised of the council and the mayor. So they would report to the committee as opposed to one mayor that was elected.
Thank you. Jim, thoughts?
Yes, I would just add that the city manager reports to the mayor and the city council. That's the way it's set up in the Beaverton Charter. Therefore, it's through the performance appraisal process, through the employment agreement that's established between the city manager and the city council and the mayor, and the goals and policies that are established by the city council are at least three ways in which that power is controlled by the elected officials. If the person was concerned about too much power in the city manager, there are ways that that can be adjusted if the city council believes that it's inappropriate. Again, employment agreements, performance appraisal that's done by the city council. There are a number of ways of doing it to control if the council thinks there's too much power in that position.
Thank you. Our next question. The current mayor's salary will be redistributed, most going to the city manager. With this redistribution in salaries, does the city have past proposed numbers to discuss? And we are going to start with Steve.
Does the city have past proposed numbers to discuss? I don't know what they're referring to. I could say that in the past we've had somebody who served in a city manager type position, and I think that position was changed. I think that Marc may be able to answer that better than I can. But as far as that goes, I don't know the answer. I don't really follow the question, I guess.
Thank you. Next, we're going to move to Jim. Do you have thoughts on this?
For me, please.
Repeat the question.
Can you repeat the question, please?
The current mayor's salary will be redistributed, most going to the city manager. With this redistribution in salaries, does he have past proposed numbers to discuss?
Like Steve, I'm a bit confused about the last clause there about past numbers. The way it would work, though, is that in most cities and counties, a recruiter is hired for a city of about the size of the city of Beaverton. And there's a salary that is established by the city council and put in the recruitment brochure. But then it's also negotiated once the council chooses the number one candidate. So it's hard today to estimate exactly what that will be. An estimate it can be given, but that exact number is probably going to change over time.
Thank you. Marc?
And I think what Jim was referring to is city manager pay. I think the question was referring to mayor pay under the new charter. And no, during the process of developing the charter, the city council did not discuss what we thought the mayor should be paid. If the charter passes, the current city council will need to take some action to establish the initial pay for the mayor under the new system, because the new charter is fairly clear that the elected council, if they want to change pay for the elected officials, can do so, but it only takes effect at the end of the term that it applies to, which means it wouldn't affect the mayor for 4 years. So the current council will have to address this if this charter passes. While we didn't discuss it, I can tell you my opinion, which is that it would certainly be lower than what the mayor is currently being paid, because the mayor's current pay is justified by those who believe in it as, you know, equivalent to what a department head would be paid. And many of our department heads are paid approximately the same as what the mayor is currently paid. A lot of local governments just pick a number. A lot of local governments tie pay of their elected people, particularly the top elected person, to some figure that's determined by other bodies. For instance, the Metro Council president at the Metro Regional Government receives an amount equal to the amount paid by the state legislature to a circuit court judge. The chair of the Multnomah County Commission is established by a review committee that does an analysis. There's all kinds of different ways that it could be determined, but my expectation is that even though the charter says the mayor will be a full-time position, it would not be paid at the same level as the mayor is today. It would be, I would imagine, significantly less.
Thank you. Our next question is, what advantage is there in having this charter amendment voted on in the May primary versus in the November general election? We're going to go back to Jim.
This is a question that I'll put to Marc because it was one that the council decided early on.
Okay, Marc?
And I'm happy to answer that. And I do realize, and we've realized all the way through this, that opinions differ on the question, and the council chose one way to do this, and other people believe we should have chosen the other. The reason that we focused on this May primary election as the time to bring this charter forward is because we do not want the consideration of this charter to be a referendum on the personality or person who is the mayor. We want the voters to think about what is the proper role for the mayor, what is the proper structure for the government of the city of Beaverton going forward. And we don't want it to be do you like the current mayor? Do you like the person who just got elected? If we were to have moved the charter to November, and if the mayor's race is taking place right now, and most likely there's going to be a mayor, then come November, what you would have is a newly elected mayor, and then a question: do you want to take authority away from this newly elected mayor? And then it becomes about that person. Right now, and I understand there are a lot of people who say that what we're doing is confusing, but it's really only slightly confusing for the candidates. I think that the voters are smart enough to recognize that they're being asked two questions. Who do you want to lead the city? And what do you want the structure of the government to be? What do you want the authority of that person to be? By separating the questions, we think we've made it more abstract and less personal.
Thank you. Steve?
And this is one of the key areas that I think that Marc just nailed it on the head. There are different ways of looking at it and different perspectives. From my perspective, I think that it is confusing for the candidates. You have three mayoral candidates running, and you've got candidates running for city council right now. The city council role, if the charter goes through, becomes a broader role than it is currently, with more responsibilities. So as a voter, I'm asking myself, who do I want to be in that role when I'm voting for city council? Now, that may or may not change when it comes to city council, but when you're changing the entire form of government, the mayor role is significant. So now I'm, as a voter, not as a candidate, but as a voter, I'm being asked to decide on the very same ballot, do I want to change the entire form of government, and in doing so, end up with a strong mayor currently, or a weak mayor if we pass that, so or a more ceremonial mayor. And so you're voting on the mayor in particular for two different roles. It could be that I, as a voter, might think that we've got, out of the three candidates, one that would be a great ceremonial mayor, but I don't think that I have the confidence in them to be a strong mayor, or vice versa. And I think that that's the conundrum that the city council now has put the voters in. I think that the confusion extends not just to the candidates that are running, but the voters. And when it gets to the candidates, you're talking about candidates that are running for positions that, here we are even tonight talking about, we have no idea what the compensation is going to be or anything else. To the extent that those candidates knew what they were getting into, there's changes that could be significant to them. And I think that that's worthy of consideration.
Thank you. Next question. With a city manager accountable to the council rather than citizens, how can we be assured that the council will be accountable to citizens in their oversight of city management? We're going to start with Marc.
So there's a great recent example that I think is a good answer to that question. But remember that, well, actually, I shouldn't say remember, because a lot of people don't know that the way that the city charter came about 40 years ago was because a number of people were angry at the city manager and wanted the city council to fire the city manager, and they wouldn't. And so they decided they were going to try to change the charter. They managed to be successful in doing so, and created the strong mayor form. And now we have direct election of the city executive. The opposite happened about 12 years ago in the city of Cornelius. There was a lot of difficulty out in Cornelius, a lot of political strife going on. And the members of the council wanted to fire the city manager, and the public loved the city manager and did not want that to happen. Well, guess what they did in order to fix that problem? They recalled 3 members of that city council in the next election. that was the retribution for a poor decision on the part of the council with respect to a popular city manager. So fundamentally, what it comes down to is you elect your representatives, your councillors, your mayor, to make the decisions on your behalf. And if you don't like those decisions, you have the power of the ballot box through recalls or through or diselecting them at the next election as a way to essentially punish somebody for making decisions that you thought were not right. The other way around is really the same thing under our current form of government. If you don't like your city manager, your city executive, who we call the mayor, you have to either recall the mayor or you have to wait till the next election cycle. So it's very comparable, actually. It's just that you're using your elected representatives to make the decision about who that administrator is, but you still hold your elected people accountable for their decisions.
Steve?
Yeah, I agree with Marc wholeheartedly. It's all a matter of the voters holding their elected officials accountable to make the decisions on their behalf. In the strong mayor form of government that we currently have, if you had any problems with the management of the city, whether it was whether or not the mayor had that mayoral aide or whatever to help manage the city, or any of the actions the mayor is responsible for, you'd vote the mayor out and replace the mayor. In the change charter, the city manager would report not to a mayor, where you'd have one person to hold accountable for it as a voter. You'd have the entire city council, and you'd have to look at the majority of the city council that would have to operate as a majority to manage that city manager. So as a voter, you've got more people that are looking at it, more people managing it, and more people operating in a committee to manage that person, to choose them, to select them, and to manage them. And that's got strengths and weaknesses to it. And I think it's up to the voters to decide how they feel about that process. But in either case, your city manager would be responsible, just like any other person hired in the city would be responsible and responsive to the elected officials who manage them and hire them.
Jim?
I don't have anything to add. I think both Steve and Marc did a good job on that one.
All right, thank you. Next question. What impact will the COVID-19 situation have on the assumptions made regarding the financial impacts of this charter change? And we are going to start with Steve.
Because you're going to start with a guy who has no idea. No, it's just my turn. I get it. No, I think that it's a real issue for everybody to consider, and I think it's going to be a challenge for us all. When we say that there will be no net impacts, we've got the money in general funds to cover the cost of adding a city manager, to adding a city councilor, and all those things. I think that works in an assumption in a normal historical trend. When we're talking about the fiscal impacts to businesses, to individuals, and to a society that ends up shutting down, I think that there's unpredictable financial impacts that are going to be costly. I look at the response that the city of Beaverton has done during COVID-19, and I'm very, very proud of the city that we've got and the leadership that we have in place, from the mayor to the city councilors and business development. Beaverton was one of the first cities to get on the map and try to help businesses proactively with a fund of $250,000. So that is a city that works, and a city that works in spite of a global pandemic. But what the financial implications are long-term, who knows? And I do think that it will impact the budget that we have to look at for not just the city of Beaverton, but for all of our federal government, state government, and other enterprises. I think it's a real question to discuss.
Jim?
The impact of COVID-19 is going to be interesting, and it's going to be vary a little bit from city to city. If a city has lots of different revenue sources, and if a lot of those revenue sources are not based on income, or in other words, people working and paying taxes, then the impact is probably going to be less. Some cities get a lot of their money just from property taxes. If that's the case, there may not be as much impact, for example, on that kind of city than there would be on the state of Oregon, which relies a lot on income taxes. So it's a partial answer to the question. Marc may have a better answer.
Marc?
Well, I don't have the answer yet because we're going to get a big chunk of the answer tomorrow evening at a budget preview meeting that is being organized by our finance team and our finance director on behalf of the City Council and the Budget Committee. So if you're interested in that, that meeting will be taking place online as well tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. where we're going to get a little insight. But I can share a tidbit, which is that we got an email from the finance director today saying he would send us some of the pre-meeting materials a little bit later than he had anticipated because ODOT is generating some new estimates of what the gasoline tax revenues for the cities might be based on reduced driving under these current circumstances. That's just one example. We would imagine, for instance, that there will also be some reduced revenues for certain telecommunication services, maybe increased revenues for others. Maybe the alcohol and marijuana tax revenues go up, who knows? But Mr. Johnson I think is right that for cities like Beaverton, where a large fraction of our city revenues is based on property taxes, unless the COVID-19 situation lasts for months and months and months, there's not likely to be a major dent in that part of the revenue. But we do anticipate, for instance, lower hotel lodging tax revenue, which is going to have some impact on our arts program going forward. Things like that are going to be meaningful. As far as the impact on the differences between before and after the charter, if the charter is approved, I don't anticipate any significant difference there. I will say, though, that I think one of the reasons that we're bringing this charter forward is that we feel that a city manager who is focused entirely on the management and administration of the city, separating that from the political leadership activities of a mayor who has to do the work where mayors are expected to be mayors, allows for more focus on those two things to be done by people concentrating on them. And I think that's to our benefit to be able to do that, which is one of the reasons why in this proposal for the charter, we made sure to specify that the mayor position is still full-time, because representing the city in those places where you need to have a mayor representing the city is very important to us. And we don't want that to be shortchanged by the need to do day-to-day management of the administrative details of the city, especially in a crisis.
Thank you. We are nearing the end of our programming. Our final question is, we have 3 candidates running for mayor on May 19th. How do voters determine which job these candidates are running for with these changes? And we are going to start with Jim.
Well, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I think I'll turn that one over to Marc. Marc is good at answering these political questions rather than my neutral role here.
Marc?
Well, one thing that it's useful to remember is, first of all, when we were developing this charter and when we decided to propose it to the voters, there were only 2 people who had signaled their intent to run for mayor, and only 2 people had filed for mayor by the time that we actually put this out to the ballot. Councilor Arnold joined the race for mayor very late in the process. However, the important point is that all 3 of them were part of the process of developing the charter. I'm pretty sure that all 9 of the work sessions we held at council, the mayor was present for. And I know he was a participant in the process of deciding which options we might choose. It was a city council decision to finalize the language the way that we did. But the current mayor and the 2 candidates for mayor were all part of this process. I don't think any one of the 3 of them are in any doubt about what is in that proposed charter. So they know very clearly that if the voters choose this charter, they're going to have one role. And if the voters don't choose this charter, they're going to have the current role of the mayor. There's no confusion in my mind. I don't believe they can have any confusion about what their role would be if this charter passes. For the voter, as I said before, I think it's really important, and we've tried to be really careful in the language that we've used to talk about this, to say that this is not about the person. This is about the role. This is about what the mayor does. This is about what the administration of the city does. And it's not about how this or that person has performed or could perform. We're trying to address capability of the city. We're trying to address future city. We're trying to address future risk for the city in case in some future day, some very strange person ends up being mayor and does odd things. But that's not an issue for today. The issue for today is, what do you want the city to be like for the next 20 to 40 years? And this, I think, is one of those fundamental questions.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, I think that if I recall the question, the question was, what are the three candidates are running? How do the voters determine? Is that the question?
Yes, we have 3 candidates running for mayor. How do we determine which job these candidates are running for with these changes?
Right. Okay, gotcha. So yeah, I with respect to Councilor Sanssouci, he's exactly correct. All of the candidates running for mayor were involved in the process. I don't know if they all agreed with it or not, or if they all felt like they were running in a job, running for a job that might be a moving target. Obviously, we have the mayor running, and the job was changing in the middle of or potentially changing in the middle of all of these discussions. Then we had Councilor Beatty throw in, and she was running, and this is all in the middle of the charter stuff. So they were all aware of it. I don't know if they supported it or not, and I won't speak for any of them. But the question, I think, was focused on what is the voter voting for, and what role is the voter voting for. And in that case, I think that that's still a huge challenge. What we've heard tonight is that the mayor's role would still be a full-time job in the new charter. The mayor's role, though, would be at a reduced salary, because they would reduce some of their job functions that they're doing, because we'd have a full-time city manager to do those on a professional basis. So we've also heard that there's a net change in compensation of around $42,000 somewhere. I'm trying to figure out the math as a voter and figure out exactly, we have a full-time mayor right now, and we would have a full-time mayor going forward with or without this charter change. So am I voting for a full-time mayor that's going to be paid less to do less? Am I voting for a full-time mayor that's going to be doing the same thing, and so forth? So I think that there are some real considerations for the voters, and that's predominantly the real challenge that I think is it's an impossible decision for the voters to decide on changing the form of government on the same day that you're choosing the people to fill the elected positions in that form of government. This charter could be handled, and quite frankly, there is some great stuff in this charter. There are some great changes in this charter that are needed, in my personal opinion. And that said, I think that the time to do that would be when there's not a contested race going on. The better time to do it would be if the elections are done and completed in May and there's not a runoff in November. We could have it on the November ballot. If we have a runoff in November, we could have it next year at the same time. And at the same time, we could get more community involvement, more engagement, and more thoughts and diversity involved in the process. And that's it.
Thank you. That is all the time we have today. Gentlemen, thank you for participating. And thank you all for attending this evening. Just a reminder, if you would like more information on the proposed charter, including a draft of the proposed charter, please go to beavertonoregon.gov/charter. If you have additional questions you would like answered, please email citymail@beavertonoregon.gov. If you would like to participate in more of these events, our next virtual charter information session will be this Saturday, April 25th at 10 a.m., featuring the same format and presenters. The proposed charter ballot measure will also be featured at the upcoming virtual Spring Voters Forum taking place on Monday, May 4th at 7 p.m. For more information on all the races being featured at the Voters Forum, as well as instructions for how to virtually access the event when the time comes, please visit beavertonoregon.gov/votersforum. Ballots will be mailed out April 29th. For a listing of Beaverton ballot drop-off locations, please visit beavertonoregon.gov/elections. Thank you everyone for watching this evening. Good night.